At the bottom of a small volcanic lake in the hills south of Rome, two enormous vessels sat undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years. When engineers finally raised them in the 1930s, what they found aboard stunned the archaeological world. These were not warships or cargo vessels. They were floating palaces with marble floors, bronze fittings, rotating sculptures, underfloor heating systems, and plumbing infrastructure so sophisticated that engineers initially struggled to believe the Romans had built it in the 1st century AD. The emperor who commissioned them was Caligula, a man history has recorded as one of Rome's most erratic and violent rulers. But the ships at the bottom of Lake Nemi raise a question that his reputation does not easily answer. If Caligula was simply a madman squandering the treasury, why do his ships contain engineering solutions that Roman civilization would not use again for centuries, and that some modern analysts regard as genuinely ahead of their time? Lake Nemi sits in the crater of an extinct volcano approximately 30 kilometers south of Rome, at an elevation that keeps it cool through the Italian summer. The Romans called it Speculum Dianae, the mirror of Diana, because its still, dark surface reflected the surrounding forest with unusual clarity. The lake had been a sacred site associated with the goddess Diana for centuries, before Caligula was born, and the sanctuary at its northern shore was one of the oldest religious complexes in Latium, drawing visitors and offerings from across the Roman world. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, a childhood nickname meaning little boots given to him by soldiers who found him endearing as a small child in military camps, became emperor in 37 AD at the age of 24, following the death of his great-uncle Tiberius. His reign began with enormous popular goodwill. He freed political prisoners, abolished abusive taxes, and staged public spectacles on a generous scale. The Roman public and Senate alike greeted his accession with relief after the paranoid final years of Tiberius. Caligula's commission of the Nemi ships likely began in the early years of his reign, when the treasury was still well stocked from Tiberius's conservative financial management. Ancient sources, including Suetonius, describe him ordering vessels of extraordinary size and luxury for use on the lake, fitted with amenities more commonly associated with imperial villas than with boats. The specific details Suetonius records: mosaic floors, gem-encrusted sterns, elaborate bathing facilities, were long treated by historians as rhetorical exaggeration, the kind of embellishment ancient biographers routinely applied to rulers they wished to portray as decadent. The excavation of the 1930s demonstrated that Suetonius had, if anything, understated what was actually aboard. The religious context of Lake Nemi matters for understanding why Caligula built there. The sanctuary of Diana Nemorensis at the lake's edge was associated with a kingship ritual that classical scholars have debated extensively. A system in which the priest of the sanctuary held his position by killing his predecessor and could be challenged for the role by any escaped slave, who could break a branch from a specific sacred tree. This strange institution, documented by multiple ancient sources, gives the lake an atmosphere of sacred danger quite different from the placid vacation spot its appearance might suggest. Building floating palaces on its surface was not simply an act of luxury. It was a statement about imperial power and its relationship to divine authority. The two Nemi ships were not identical. The first, smaller vessel measured approximately 70 meters in length and 20 meters in beam, roughly the size of a modern ocean-going tugboat, which gives some sense of scale for a lake vessel in the ancient world. The second was larger still, at approximately 73 meters long and 24 meters wide. Both sat at the same location on the lake bottom, which suggested to excavators that they had been deliberately sunk rather than lost to storms or accident. What the recovery operation revealed about their construction challenged assumptions that had been standard in classical scholarship for generations. The hulls were built using a sophisticated system of lead sheathing over wooden planking with the lead sheets fastened by bronze tacks in a pattern designed to prevent marine organism penetration. A technique documented in the literature on ancient shipbuilding but rarely seen in such complete preservation. The wood preserved beneath the sheathing after nearly 2 millennia in the anaerobic lake sediment was identifiable as high-quality fir and oak, selected and worked with evident care. The bronze fittings recovered from the ships included pieces of mechanical complexity that generated immediate scholarly debate. Rotating sockets, essentially ancient ball bearings, were found in sufficient numbers to suggest they were a standard component of the ships. Mechanical systems used to allow heavy decorative elements or structural components to turn smoothly. Ball bearings as a concept appear in Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks as a Renaissance innovation. Finding functional examples aboard a 1st century Roman vessel required a revision of the timeline for this technology. The plumbing systems were equally striking. Lead pipes of multiple diameters, connected by bronze fittings, ran through sections of both vessels in configurations consistent with a pressurized water distribution system, bringing fresh water to multiple points throughout the ship rather than relying on carried containers. Analysis of the pipe connections showed evidence of threaded joints, another feature of Roman engineering that classical sources mention, but physical examples of which are relatively rare in the archaeological record before the Nemi discovery. The interior fittings recovered from the Nemi ships during the 1930s excavation filled the purpose-built museum at the lake's edge with objects of considerable refinement. Floor surfaces were covered with opus sectile, geometric patterns assembled from cut pieces of coloured marble and stone, a decorative technique used in the most prestigious Roman buildings of the period. The specific marbles identified included varieties imported from Greece, North Africa, and Asia Minor, indicating that the ship's outfitting drew on the same Mediterranean-wide supply network that furnished imperial buildings in Rome itself. Wall surfaces showed evidence of painted plaster decoration, though the long submersion had destroyed most of the paint layer. Bronze hardware, hinges, handles, decorative mounts, lamp holders, was recovered in substantial quantities, much of it cast with figural decoration at a quality consistent with workshop production for elite clients. Several bronze animal head fittings, likely decorative prow ornaments or mooring ring supports, were among the most visually striking objects recovered and became signature pieces of the Nemi Museum collection. The evidence for heated spaces aboard the larger vessel was particularly significant. Tegulae mammatae, hollow box tiles used in Roman underfloor heating systems, were found in configurations suggesting that at least one section of the larger ship's interior was equipped with a hypercaust, the underfloor heating system standard in Roman bath complexes and wealthy domestic architecture. Installing a hypercaust in a vessel requires managing the fire risk that a combustion-based heating system creates in a wooden structure, and the engineering solution apparently used aboard the Nemi ship, details of which were partially recoverable from the surviving structural remains, was sophisticated enough to attract specific comment from the Italian engineers overseeing the recovery. Ancient sources describe Caligula entertaining guests aboard these vessels, holding banquets, and using them as a base for activities at the lake sanctuary. The physical evidence of the ship's interiors is consistent with that function. These were spaces designed for the display of imperial wealth and the comfort of elite company, equipped with the infrastructure to support extended occupation rather than brief excursions. Caligula's reign lasted less than 4 years. On January 24, 41 AD, he was assassinated by a group of Praetorian Guard officers led by a tribune named Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had repeatedly humiliated in public. The killing took place in a covered passage beneath the Palatine Hill during the Palatine Games, and was followed immediately by the murder of Caligula's wife, Caesonia, and their infant daughter. The Senate met in emergency session, and within hours the Guard had proclaimed Caligula's uncle Claudius as the new emperor. presenting the Senate with a fait accompli that effectively ended any brief Republican aspirations the assassination may have inspired among some senators. The sources for Caligula's reign, primarily Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and the Jewish writer Philo of Alexandria, were written decades after his death, and reflect a tradition of hostile portraiture that classicists have increasingly questioned. The charges against him include claims of incest, declaring himself a living god, appointing his horse to the consulship, and a range of sadistic cruelties against senators and others. Some of these accounts are almost certainly exaggerated or invented. The horse story, for instance, appears in Suetonius as a threatened insult to the Senate rather than an actual appointment. The degree to which Caligula was genuinely unstable versus simply politically ruthless in ways that made powerful enemies is a question modern historians approach with more nuance than ancient sources allow. What happened to the Nemi ships after his death is documented in outline. The new regime under Claudius had no interest in maintaining monuments to his disgraced predecessor's extravagance. Ancient sources indicate the ships were sunk, deliberately flooded and allowed to settle to the lake bottom, as part of a broader damnatio memoriae, the Roman practice of erasing a condemned ruler's public legacy. The vessels that had represented the peak of first-century Roman engineering capability sank into the volcanic sediment of Lake Nemi, where they would remain largely undisturbed for the next 19 centuries. The existence of large ancient vessels at the bottom of Lake Nemi was not a secret. Local tradition preserved knowledge of them, and by the medieval period, the lake had acquired a reputation among Romans and travellers as the site of submerged imperial wonders. The first documented attempt to recover or investigate the ships dates to 1446, when Cardinal Prospero Colonna commissioned the architect and humanist Leon Battista Alberti to attempt a salvage operation using floating platforms and divers. Alberti's approach, attaching grappling hooks to the submerged wood and attempting to haul sections to the surface, succeeded in bringing up fragments of timber, lead pipes and bronze fittings which confirmed the ship's existence and their remarkable state of preservation. But the method was too crude to recover intact structural sections, and the operation was abandoned after damaging whatever it had managed to hook. The fragments, recovered by Alberti, circulated among Roman humanist circles as curiosities and eventually disappeared from the historical record, their current whereabouts unknown. Subsequent attempts in the following centuries employed variations of the same basic approach. Divers, grappling equipment, improvised floating platforms, and produced similar results. Fragments recovered, structures damaged, no systematic knowledge gained. A more serious effort in 1895, organised by the Italian government and using improved diving technology, managed to recover additional bronze fittings and structural timbers, including several of the ball-bearing bassais that would later become the most technically discussed artefacts from the site. These objects entered the collection of the Museo Nazionale Romano in Rome, where some remain today. The critical change came in the 1920s, when Benito Mussolini's government decided that the complete recovery of the Nemi ships would serve as a demonstration of fascist Italy's continuity with Roman imperial greatness. The project was given government resources on a scale that previous private salvage operations had never approached, and the engineering solution chosen was radical. Drain the lake. The decision to lower Lake Nemi's water level by pumping was not taken lightly. The lake fed local agriculture, supplied water to surrounding communities, and was embedded in centuries of local economic and cultural life. Mussolini's government overrode these concerns and began pumping operations in October 1928, using electric pumps installed at the lake's outlet. Over the following 2 years, the water level dropped by approximately 23 metres, gradually exposing the lake bed and the 2 vessels resting on it. What the retreating water revealed was described by contemporary observers as one of the most extraordinary archaeological moments of the 20th century. The ships emerged from the sediment in a state of preservation far exceeding what anyone had reasonably expected. Wood that had been submerged for nearly 2,000 years was still structurally intact in many sections, preserved by the combination of anaerobic conditions in the volcanic lake sediment and the lead sheathing that had protected the outer hull surfaces. The bronze fittings were green with patina but physically complete. The marble floor sections were cracked but present. A purpose-built museum was constructed on the lake shore to house the vessels, which were too large and fragile to transport to Rome. The building, designed specifically to accommodate the ship's dimensions, opened in 1936 and became an immediate attraction for Italian and foreign visitors. The Nemi ships were presented by fascist cultural machinery as evidence of Roman imperial genius and, by implication, of the continuity between ancient Roman and contemporary Italian greatness. Exactly the propaganda purpose Mussolini had envisioned when he authorised the draining operation. For 6 years, archaeologists, engineers, and historians had access to the most significant surviving example of first-century Roman naval and mechanical engineering ever recovered. The ball-bearing devices were studied and published. The plumbing systems were documented. The decorative programme was partially reconstructed from surviving fragments. The information accumulated during those 6 years constitutes almost everything the modern world knows about the Nemi ships in physical detail. On the night of May 31 to June 1, 1944, the Nemi Museum burned. By morning, both ships had been destroyed. What had survived nearly 2,000 years at the bottom of a volcanic lake was gone in a single night, 11 months before the end of the Second World War in Europe. The fire occurred while the Castelli Romani area, the hill towns south of Rome, including the village of Nemi, was in the zone of active military operations. Allied forces had broken through the German defensive lines at Monte Cassino in May 1944 and were advancing on Rome, which would be liberated on June 4. German units were withdrawing through the area in the days immediately surrounding the museum fire. The question of responsibility for the destruction has never been definitively resolved. Italian post-war investigations produced testimony supporting multiple competing accounts. Some witnesses described seeing German soldiers in the area of the museum on the night in question. Others reported that the fire appeared to have started from inside the building. A German officer who had been billeted near the museum gave a statement after the war indicating that no German unit under his knowledge had been ordered to destroy the site, but acknowledged that he could not account for the actions of all personnel in the area during the chaotic withdrawal. The hypothesis that the destruction was deliberate, either as a scorched earth measure by withdrawing German forces or as an act by Italian partisans attempting to deny the site's propaganda value to the occupiers, has never been conclusively supported or refuted. The hypothesis that the fire was accidental, caused by military activity in the vicinity of a wooden museum building in a war zone, is equally impossible to rule out. The Italian government's post-war conclusion was that German forces were responsible, but the evidentiary basis for this finding was disputed at the time and has been questioned by subsequent historians. The destruction of the ships in 1944 was not total, in the sense that every artefact associated with them was lost. The bronze fittings recovered during the 1895 diving operations and held at the Museo Nazionale Romano in Rome survived the war in the city's museum collections. Scale models of both vessels, constructed with considerable accuracy during the 1930s excavation, survived and remain on display at the rebuilt Nemi Museum, which reopened after the war with reproductions and documentation in place of the original objects. Detailed technical drawings, measurements, and photographs taken during the recovery and conservation work of the 1930s were preserved in archives and have formed the basis for subsequent scholarly analysis of the ship's engineering. The documentation is not complete. Some aspects of the ship's construction were not fully recorded before the fire, but it is extensive enough to support the engineering and historical analysis that has continued in the decades since. Sediment at the lake bottom in the area where the ships rested has been the subject of renewed investigation using modern archaeological methods. Core samples taken from the site in recent decades have recovered small fragments of wood, lead, and bronze from the layer corresponding to the ship's original resting position, confirming that residual material remains in the sediment. Whether sufficient intact structural material survives for meaningful physical analysis is uncertain, but the possibility has not been ruled out by researchers who have reviewed the sampling data. The question of a possible third Nemi vessel has circulated in the scholarship since the 1930s excavation. Suetonius's account of Caligula's lake activities uses plural language that some classicists have read as implying more than 2 ships. And sonar surveys of the lake conducted in the 1990s identified at least one additional anomaly on the lake bottom that was not satisfactorily explained by the known positions of the 2 excavated vessels. No follow-up investigation of this anomaly has been published. The Nemi ships complicate the standard portrait of Caligula in ways that classical scholarship has been working through since the 1930s recovery. The standard account, derived primarily from Suetonius and Cassius Dio, presents Caligula as a ruler whose behaviour became increasingly irrational after a severe illness in the first year of his reign. A man who squandered a large treasury surplus in under a year, terrorised the Senate, and whose megalomania expressed itself in the kind of purposeless extravagance that the Nemi ships supposedly represent. The engineering reality of those ships does not fit that characterization. Purposeless extravagance does not produce functional ball bearings, integrated plumbing systems, and underfloor heating in a nautical context. These features required systematic engineering knowledge, skilled execution, and the kind of project management capable of coordinating specialized craftsmen across multiple technical domains simultaneously. Whatever else Caligula was, the Nemi project demonstrates that he was capable of commissioning and overseeing work of genuine technical sophistication. The broader historical reassessment of Caligula, associated particularly with the work of classicist Anthony Barrett, whose 1989 biography remains a standard reference, argues that the ancient hostile tradition overstates his irrationality and understates the degree to which his conflicts with the Senate reflected deliberate political choices rather than mental instability. Barrett and subsequent scholars point out that nearly all ancient sources for Caligula's reign were written by or for members of the senatorial class that Caligula repeatedly antagonized, creating a systematic bias in the historical record. The Nemi ships fit into this reassessment as physical evidence that stands independent of the literary tradition. Whatever the ancient sources say about Caligula's state of mind, the objects his engineers built demonstrate a level of technical capability that was real, documented, and ahead of what the standard narrative of Roman technological development would predict for the mid-1st century AD. The destruction of the Nemi ships in 1944 is a particular kind of historical loss. Not the slow erosion of time or the indifference of neglect, but the deliberate or careless elimination of something irreplaceable during a period when human beings were comprehensively failing to protect anything. The Second World War destroyed archaeological and cultural heritage across Europe and beyond on a scale that is still being catalogued. The Nemi ships are one entry in a very long list. What makes their loss specifically painful from a historical perspective is the timing. 6 years of access to the best preserved example of 1st century Roman engineering was not enough. The documentation produced during that period is valuable, but documentation is not the same as the object. Physical analysis techniques developed after 1944. Isotopic dating, molecular analysis of organic residues, CT scanning of metal objects to reveal internal structure, could have extracted information from the Nemi ships that the 1930s investigators had no means to gather. that information is permanently unavailable. The case for continued investigation of the Lake Nemi site rests on the possibility that residual material in the sediment may yield something to modern analytical methods. Italian and international researchers have periodically proposed systematic underwater survey and sampling programs, and some preliminary work has been done. The political and funding landscape for such projects is challenging, but the technological capability to conduct meaningful investigation without physically disturbing the site, using acoustic imaging, sediment coring, and remote sensing exists and has improved substantially in recent decades. The broader lesson the Nemi ships offer is about the relationship between power, engineering, and historical memory. Caligula built something extraordinary, in a location charged with religious significance, using technical knowledge that his civilization possessed but rarely applied at this scale. The regime that succeeded him sank it. A dictator's government razed it 2,000 years later for political purposes. A war destroyed it before the world could fully understand what it was. What survived is documentation, fragments, and the knowledge that somewhere at the bottom of a small volcanic lake in the hills south of Rome, the sediment still holds traces of the most technically ambitious naval project of the ancient Roman world.